Good afternoon, everyone, and warmly welcome to this Studia Generalia lecture by ArtsEqual Research Initiative and the Center for Educational Research and Academic Development in the Arts here at the University of the Arts, Helsinki. My name is Marja-Leena Juntunen, and I have a great pleasure to introduce to you our honored guest speaker from the United States. And we feel very privileged to have him here today. Michael W. Apple is the John Pascom Professor of Curriculum and Instruction and Educational Policy Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, USA. He has worked with progressive educational systems, governments, universities, unions, and activist and dissident groups throughout the world to democratize educational research, policy, and practice. Professor Apple has written extensively on the politics of educational reform, on the relationship between culture and power, and on education for social justice. Among his most recent books are Knowledge, Power, and Education, and Can Education Change Society? Professor Apple has been selected one of the 50 most important educational scholars in the 20th century. His books Ideology and Curriculum and Official Knowledge were also selected as two of the most significant books on education in the 20th century. Professor Apple is also a member of the ArtsEqual Advisory Board. His lecture today is titled, Are International Educational Reform Really Democratic? Please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Apple.
We're live? Good. Okay. It's a pleasure to be here for a variety of reasons. The first and most important, it's lovely to be back in Helsinki among friends. Second is the weather, and anyone who is here in this room needs to immediately see your therapist, since clearly after yesterday, the real Professor Apple, Professor Rima Apple, in the back of the room, and I went for a walk today. Even I do not want to be in this room right now. So I think the entire population of Helsinki is outside. So I owe you a great debt immediately. The third reason, which I wish was a joke and isn't, is it is lovely to be away from our beloved resident, since I do not consider him a president, and that is Mr. Donald Trump, who is doing things. He has made the unsayable sayable and the undoable doable. And unfortunately, I found out on the news today that the first thing that is done on the news in this nation is the news from Washington, D.C. with Donald Trump. Thank you so much. I'm going to find an island off the coast of Helsinki that does not get television, but enough humor. Seriously, what I want to do today is to remind us of what is out there. Those things that I thought could not happen in those nations I thought could not happen are now happening. So I have worked in Argentina and Brazil since 1986, and my first office in Brazil was the office of the military censor. Some of you have understood these kinds of issues in this room. And I thought it would be impossible for a right-wing government that wished to privatize education could ever be alive. Yet that is exactly what is happening in Brazil. It is happening in Argentina. And my friends in Stockholm, my friends in Oslo and Trondheim remind me constantly that the unsayable is sayable and that the undoable is in fact doable in those nations like Denmark as well, where no one believed it is possible for right-wing assemblages to go on. Yet education is being fundamentally restructured in ways that make me quite ill and angry. And let me remind all of us that conversations about education are not conversations about the weather. They're more than a little serious. And we now have the possibility in every nation of the world, including a nation I have the most respect for in terms of its education system, though it has flaws, and that is Finland. Right? So my lecture today will be one that looks at the world and says, this is what is happening, and asks you not to agree with what is happening, since almost everyone in this room, I would assume, disagrees, but to ask what must be done so that it doesn't happen here. All right? I will go on until midnight. I have ordered pizza for everyone. Being from the United States, I will ask you to pay for it, however. Okay. All right. You'll forgive my humor. I know that that's not nice if we're being streamed. I will try to keep my words less New Jersey, meaning I won't swear too often. But my teaching style comes from an experience. My last name is Apple, as you know. My first 3 years were teaching in the slums of the city I grew up in the same schools I went to, but I was a substitute teacher under contract from the local Ministry of Education, and I went into a new classroom every day. And if you go into a kindergarten classroom and the students walk in and you introduce yourself as their substitute teacher, say, hello, children, my name is Mr. Apple, you better have a very juvenile sense of humor or you will not survive. So it'll take 3 days for the children to get off the light fixtures and to settle down. So occasionally I will make feeble attempts at being humorous. Do not misinterpret the humor. This is deadly serious stuff. All right? I want to start out by reminding us that education is not a neutral act. It has never been a neutral act. It is an ethical commitment, and it is an act of influence. And because of that, it must be held accountable to ethical and essentially political norms. It is someone doing something to someone else. It is a choice among various kinds of knowledge. It is a form of pedagogy that speaks to the identities of people that you wish to create. Therefore, we must use particular kinds of concepts to understand what and why we do particular kinds of things. All right? Now, that means I want to introduce 2 concepts that will guide my talk today. And these are, in essence, the glasses, or if you understand Wittgenstein, or those of you who have been in seminars about rhetoric, you'll understand from Austin and others that language can do multiple things. So I want us to use language in a particular way. And the 2 concepts, I do have a degree in analytic philosophy, so you can ask those kinds of questions. I'll pretend to know what I'm talking about later on about that. But there are 2 concepts I want to introduce. The first is what we might want to call relational analysis, which says simply the following. No institution or practice can be understood unless we connect it to its underlying institutional forms and practices. It is known not by its objectification in one's hand, like a school or a curriculum. It is known by its relations to those issues of dominance and subordination in the larger society. I don't want to argue for that, I want to stipulate that. A good example of that is the following. When I was making the notes for my lecture today, I walked up the stairs in the teacher education building where my office is located. I opened the door, I turned on the light, I turned on the computer went on, and I began to type. Yes, Michael Apple walked into the teacher education building. I walked up the stairs. I opened the door. I turned on the computer went on. I began to type. That is actually less important than the fact that in my city we burn coal to produce electricity. And that means even for me to give a progressive lecture to a group of very talented people who normally would agree with my arguments, I just had an anonymous but very real relationship with the 350 or more miners who must die or be badly injured for the coal to be burned, for me to have the benefit of speaking to you today. Okay? So this is what I mean by sets of relations, and it means that even things that we think are good must be questioned about what are the hidden things that go on underneath what we normally recognize. The second concept I want to introduce is what is called repositioning in feminist theory, and that says the following. Yes, Michael Apple is a white, straight male. That means that certain identities are privileged. I must look at the world through the eyes of those things I am not. What is it like to be a woman in this society when the lights go out? When there's no light in a parking lot, and many of my women students in my curriculum and sociology courses, when they walk to the bus at night, they will take out their cell phones even if the battery is dead and pretend to talk. My body in space is privileged. I am a man. Okay? So I must look at the world through the eyes of those people who do not benefit from the spatial relationships, the racialized forms, etc. Am I clear? So those are the glasses I want us to put on. That's the underlying point about all of this. That means I must look at education, again, as an ethical and political act. And let me just note that very, very quickly. Education is political in a variety of ways. The first is whether I like it or not in this nation and in many, many others, and profoundly in the United States, if I know the people who raise you, parents, significant others, I know what they do for pay or not for pay, and I know which part of the city you live in, I can predict within one standard deviation how well you will do on any national examination. I hate that. It would be so much worse if it wasn't for the work of people involved in ArtsEqual, as an example. Okay? But it is the case. Second, it is political because there's a form of knowledge, and from the vast assemblage of knowledge, certain groups' knowledge is considered legitimate, and other groups' knowledge is seen as popular. And thinking relationally, all of our concepts must have their opposite to give them meaning. So black requires white. Being Finnish requires that someone not be Finnish. Being male requires not necessarily its opposite, but another construction of gendered form. All right? So, even for me to say this knowledge is good, this is what I should teach in music or mathematics or literature, I must have something that is considered not worthy. In fact, as Charles Mills reminds us in a brilliant book called The Racial Contract, our very understanding of democracy is based on a vision of rationality. Rational citizens who can make choices will vote. But in order to have a definition of rationality, I must have a concept of the irrational. And the history of liberalism and social democracy is something that says the following: rational citizens deserve rights. And that occurs at a time in the English language of empire. Women must be counted as irrational, hence the struggle over their voting, which took hundreds of years. Immigrants are considered less rational. People of color are considered less rational. And people who are gay or lesbian are considered dangerous and not fully human. That's the history of the concepts, all right? So the knowledge that we teach is what Raymond Williams calls the selective tradition. It is someone's knowledge. That does not make it bad, but we must be held accountable to the epistemological norms that we are using. There's a third issue, and that is underneath what we think we are doing, we are teaching so much more. It is what has historically been called the hidden curriculum. So if I go on too long, those of you with computers out have already learned profoundly what to do. Okay? Email will be struck open. Facebook, I'm an old-fashioned person, Facebook. Right? My grandchildren now are going, they talked about Facebook, my God, how old. Okay. So, but all joking aside, it is clear that the norms of discipline, of values, of cooperation, of music, for instance, being something that everyone has and can perform, that normative structure is crucial, and that is taught, I would hope. There's also the question of teaching. Any occupation that is seen as women's paid work or seen as feminized, even if men do it, gets less pay, less respect, and less autonomy. So we have to ask, who is doing the teaching? Why in the United States, for instance, are there moves now to close colleges of education because anyone can teach? And in my own state of Wisconsin, the home of many, many people from Finland, the state legislature has proposed, and has yet to vote on it, that anyone with a high school diploma can teach primary school. So the disrespect for teachers is immense, and the fact that primary school teachers are by and large women has a long history about that. And I'll actually read a diary of a teacher in a few minutes to document that. There's also the question of money and power. We may have elegant theories about the place of the arts and music, but because of budget cuts, there may be no music teacher. The city of Los Angeles in the last 5 years, in my own nation, has not hired an art teacher or a music teacher in 5 years. Okay? We all could recite why the arts are so crucial to any society that cares. That's not the issue. The issue is profoundly that capital has engaged ongoing on strike. It has refused to pay its fair share of taxes. Right? It's also a question, if you will, of voice. Who gets to speak about this? And by and large, many, many people whose voices are not heard. This is not new. So I now want to remind us that this is not new, for I talk about this situation that's growing in many nations. I have this horrible, horrible need to look at the words of teachers. I think it's a very bad trait. I apologize publicly for it, but somehow one of the voices not heard is the voices of teachers. This is from a teacher's diary from 1899. It's the first public schools, public meaning state-supported. It's not a British use of that term. In the city of Boston, it is an illegal school in that it has black and white children in it, which we tend to think in the United States was only in the South. In the North, it was just as segregated, and there are many, many enslaved people there. You'll notice the word enslaved is a verb, not a noun. There is no such thing as a slave. Someone must do it to you. It is a relationship. Okay, so there were enslaved people and free African Americans in the school. This is a 18 and a half when she wrote this, year-old teacher. She did well in secondary school, had 6 months at a state normal school, and was teaching in the slums. Her name is Emma. I need to read her voice. I will not cross-dress. I will not raise my voice, okay? But pretend that Michael Apple is now Emma. Okay? She has been told by the principal of her school, he will come in and observe her. She's been teaching for 3 months. It is to see, with one observation, whether she'll be given a permanent contract. Dear God, that's a nice start. Dear God, the principal has told me he is coming in to observe my classroom tomorrow. Dear God, I am so afraid. I know what he will do. He will choose one child to stand and read. Oh, dear God, what if he chooses the wrong child? What will happen to me? The next day, Emma returns. Oh, my God. The principal came into my room today. I knew that the proper way to read in the public school in this year, 1899, was to have the child say page 35, chapter 4, and the child must hold the book in her right hand, not the left, and the toes must be pointed at a perfect angle of 45 degrees. This is now back to Michael. This is Foucault before Foucault was born, okay? We didn't need Foucault to understand this, by the way. This is the life of a teacher and a child. The head must be held straight and high. The eyes must look directly ahead. The pupil would have to lift up their voice and struggle in loud, unnatural tones. Dear God, I had attended to the position of the toes. I had remembered the right eye and the nose, but I had forgotten to enforce the mentioning of page and chapter. The principal looked angry. He walked out of my room and slammed the door. I fear my teaching career is at an end. I could leave the rest of my lecture unstated now, because these people are back, okay? But there's more to this story. I will return to Emma's words at the end. Since Emma was fired, by the way, she did not get renewed, and formed the first teachers union in Boston in the United States, went on to become the superintendent of schools of that same city, and at midnight +1 of the first day that she was installed as the superintendent of schools, that is the local minister of education, she removed this way of evaluating students and teachers. That's very important for us to remember. We have been through this before. All right? Okay. This is my Foucaultian moment. I can control your bodies. I have something to drink. Unfortunately, it is water. Please, may that be rectified later on. Okay. All right. So this is not new. These politics and the control of bodies, these dispositions and values. Unfortunately, the politics can be progressive, they can be retrogressive, and right now they are fundamentally retrogressive in many nations, though rhetorically they are couched in the language of democracy. So I want to deconstruct the way democracy is being used. I hope I do well on the examination for those of you who are looking at my rhetoric. Haiti was clear that this would be a test of me, not of you. So thank you so much. All right. I will now return to speaking Swedish. That was a bad joke. That's not nice. Okay. So there has been a recognition of one of my favorite theorists in the world, and that is of Antonio Gramsci's points, that in order to win in civil society, you must win in the state. And in order to win in the state, you must change people's consciousness of the key words that they use. We must change the meaning of the words we use to say what is a good school, what is a bad school, what is a good student, what is a good teacher, what is a good social end. And the task of dominant groups is to understand powerfully how that is done, and also the fundamental role of the school in the transformations of common sense. So for the right, the curriculum is crucial, teaching is crucial, while the left says it is all about the economy all the time. And as someone, so much of the left, that is my history, I find that deeply essentializing, and I think quite repulsive, because it again is a form of disrespect for those people who labor so hard in those institutions called schools. And those of you who have been deeply involved in the ArtsEqual projects about music, for instance, understand how important the struggle over curriculum and teaching, over issues of disability, and over issues of age and race and class are to the reconstruction of society. But the right understands that and acts on it profoundly at a larger level than we are able to. It's one of the reasons I am so enthusiastic about the ArtsEqual project. There is no misrecognition about the importance of curriculum there. All right. So the right is now mobilized around these issues about the politics of curriculum, teaching, etc. And in fact, they take their impulse from that principal who looked at Emma and said, "You're gone." So I want us to think about this in an interesting way, using the metaphor of an umbrella. The way Gramsci reminds us that dominant groups don't assume false consciousness, that people don't understand their daily life. They assume that people have contradictory consciousness, elements of good sense and bad sense. So none of us are stupid about what is happening in our lives. And the right's job is to reach inside people's consciousness, with education being a profound statement about that, and connect their assemblage of values and dispositions and epistemological forms to the elements of good sense that people have. And many, many people assume rightly that it is raining in education. So in many, many nations of the world, it is raining if you're a teacher. So in the United States, for instance, there are no tests of the arts, of the physical, of literature. We test in 2 subjects: mathematics, and reading. Not literacy, reading skills. And if you are poor, you do nothing but test preparation and curriculum based on the all-important tests, because we have installed performance pay for teachers. So teachers will be paid more if their children score higher than the predicted value on the all-important tests. So when I ask teachers, what are you doing creatively? I quote now, we don't have time to do that. All right? So this is a reality in many nations, not just the United States. So the right says, for teachers it is raining. They feel under pressure, and they don't like the tests at all. For those people who are capitalists, who have a huge amount of money, it is raining in education. I quote now from a hedge fund manager in England, schools are black holes into which money is poured, and PISA results do not come out. So for capital, it is raining in education. For parents in declining economies, an example would be if you listen to people in Brazil right now, they will say the following, powerfully so. I am very worried about my child's future. I want my child to be prepared to get good PISA scores. I don't want things to be taught that will not get her a job. It is raining in education. For administrators in many, many nations now who do not have tenure and do not have unions in most nations, it is raining in education, because if the teachers and students do not get comparatively high scores, they will lose their positions. So the half-life of a superintendent of schools in the United States right now is 3 years, meaning the person who is in charge of the chief administration of a school district lasts only 3 years before being asked to move or looking for another job. And this is true internationally increasingly. So it is raining in education, and the task of dominant groups is to reach in and say there are multiple umbrellas. You can go under Michael's umbrella or Hades' umbrella, okay, Alexis' umbrella. You can go under that, but that's got the arts in it, and that will not be good for jobs. Or you can go under Elena's umbrella, who promises jobs for the children. Okay? So increasingly, there's a different discursive construction of what's going on. And the group behind this is what I want to call conservative modernization. And this is important because too many people assume this is only neoliberalism. It's not. It is a misperception. It is simply rhetorical. So I want to call this a group that has formed what Gramsci would call a new hegemonic bloc, a new alliance of people that don't all agree on everything, but are willing to compromise, unlike people of the left. My grandfather's favorite joke in the whole world, I can't believe I'm now channeling my grandfather, saying, Michael, when the left lines up in a firing squad, it lines up in a circle. We do not need the right to kill us. We're perfectly good at doing it ourselves. Unfortunately, that is true in too many nations. So there are 4 groups holding this umbrella of what I want to call conservative modernization. Neoliberals who believe one simple thing, private is good and public is bad. You've probably followed the choice programs that are growing in Norway and certainly in Sweden. So this is nearly here. Okay? And this is a group in many ways that is saying we must bring in corporate assemblages. People do better when they're in competition. Schools must compete with each other. And the all-important tests are the metric for engaging in that competition. There's and they believe in what is called a weak state. Lessen state control so it is inefficient for you to have music for all. It costs too much money. So this is the argument in the United States right now. Do in the arts. It is expensive, and unless we can guarantee employment in an ad agency, why are you doing this in the first place? I find that deeply repulsive, but it happens to be the discourse that is now circulating. So they want a weak state. That will be important in a second. And their task in many ways is to change the very meaning of democracy. So democracy, if we were to have a conversation, so if I were to ask Tuulikki from your dissertation, a marvelous piece of work, by the way. I'll say that again tomorrow, I promise. Okay? But it will cost you more if I say it twice. If I were to say, look, tell me about these schools that you have written about. Tell me about why you think they're more democratic. It would not be that when we compare them to other schools, the test scores are higher. It's about the identities that are formed, about the rights and values that are there, that are being lived, about the identities that are being in formation, about the way in which music is democratized and who counts as a musician is democratized as well. It's what in philosophy we call thick visions of democracy. And the task of dominant groups, especially neoliberals, is to say that is inefficient. We need what is called thin visions of democracy. Democracy is simply consumption practices on a market. So the world becomes a vast supermarket, and if I can guarantee parents' choice in schools, then that is sufficient. So social justice will take care of itself by individual identities that depend on a market for making good choices. So as long as Michael makes a good choice for my children, the world is democratic. It is Adam Smith without ever having read The Wealth of Nations. So the academic father of the theories that guide this neoliberal agenda in The Wealth of Nations, this is my favorite quote in economics, that must never leave this room. It's not by Karl Marx, okay? It's not by Keynes. It is by Adam Smith, a brilliant statement on page 313. Don't look it up now, the page may be wrong, okay? In the first edition, okay? On page 313, Adam Smith says, under capitalism, for every one rich person, there must be 500 poor ones. And the must is italicized. Now, he was brilliant and wrong arithmetically. It's probably closer to 100,000. But that is a brilliant understanding of the way in which this works. So the world then is seen as a vast supermarket. I love the metaphor, it's powerful. But the task is ideological transformation, to see ourselves as profit-maximizing individuals where social justice will take care of itself. So the world, again, is a vast supermarket. I love the metaphor. It's very, very powerful because in supermarkets, there's some people who can go into K-Market and buy any damn thing they please. And there are others who must stand outside the window of the supermarket, and they can engage in what we might call postmodern consumption. They can eat the image of the product, the simulacrum of the product. All right? Now, this is a vision, if you will, then, of something that is actually extraordinarily destructive. We know from vast amounts of empirical and historical research that it is not educators by themselves or individual consumption practices that transform curriculum and teaching on a large scale. Social mobilizations and social movements are the engines of democratization. So women would not have gotten the right to vote if women collectively had not said, you can't do this to me anymore. This is why we want teacher unions and syndicates, as an example. All right? So we have vast amounts of empirical information, yet the identities that are created under neoliberalism are not collective. They're not about social movements. It's about Michael making a choice of my child. So let me place this from the abstraction now to the real world. Let's pretend, I know this will be horrifying to you, let's pretend there are two Michael Apples in this room. I know that that's a dastardly thing. There's Michael Apple sub 1 as I am now, a well-known professor with a decent salary. I love my children, okay? Michael Apple as I was many, many, many years ago, before the beard. And my parents loved me just as much as I love my children now. Okay? But they worked in factories, and they had to be at the factory at 6:30 in the morning. So, under neoliberalism, The initial form is selection and choice. The government gives Michael sub 1 a check and says, Michael, you can go and bring your child to any school you wish. And I say there's that brilliant school on the other side of Helsinki or Chicago or New York or London, that great academy over there. I will take my child and give that school the check to pay for my child. It is government funding, okay, because I love my child, okay? Michael Apple, sub 2, government gives me the check. I don't have a car. And neoliberals, as you know, throughout the world, have destroyed public transportation. So it now takes me 3 buses to get there. It's 2.5 hours to get across London to get to that good school over there in the leafy suburb. All right? So I have choice. And I say to my boss when I go to the factory at 6:30 in the morning to clock in, boss, look at this check. It's 7,000 pounds. 8,000 US dollars. I want to take my beloved child over there. I have a choice. This is democracy. And the boss says to me, well, Michael, you do have choice. You can be here at 6:30 in the morning or not. That's your choice. Michael Apple, sub 1. I call up my secretary and I say, Tom, I always meet my undergraduates who are planning to be teachers at 8 in the morning, 2 days a week, to discuss their program and to get insights and to advise them. Please contact them through email. You have the list. Tell them I can no longer do that because I'm going to start my car, and when it's -30 in Madison, as it is here, right, I can get in my car that starts because it's a nice car, and I can drive across the city in great comfort. My dean will not say to Michael Apple, John Baskin professor, you're no longer meeting your undergraduates at 8 in the morning. We know empirically, robustly, that markets create inequalities more often than they solve them. All right, so I want to, if the claim by governments now is that evidence-based practices, there is no robust evidence in any nation of the world that markets are democratic. The choice processes are, but if we think relationally, there's real choice and not choice. I mentioned as well, this is a vision of a weak state. It is not a weak state, it is a very strong state. Underneath the choice is strong state control, but of a different form of the state. I'll give one example of this. In the state of Wisconsin, which is the home of US socialism, it's the most radical university and the most radical state in the United States. 1 out of every 4 African-American young men is in prison. So, the simplest concept in economics, I will exemplify with this pen, is what is called a zero-sum game. Here's the amount of money that the state has. What we have now under neoliberalism in education and elsewhere is a vast tax transfer process in which money that would go to women's health, education, teachers' salaries, teacher education, is transferred to the prison system. That is not a weak state. It is what Althusser would call not the ideological state apparatus, but the repressive state apparatus. Poor young men and women are guarding poor African-American young men and women. All right, am I clear about that? This is very important because behind the rhetoric of we are democratizing is quite a repressive apparatus. So if Michael Apple sub 2 is African-American, I don't have that choice. First of all, I don't have a job often, but if I did, I can lose it very, very easily. So the fiction of choice is exactly that, and it's a racialized agenda. Okay, let me move on now to neoconservatives. Neoconservatives are required for neoliberalism to be put into place, for markets to form around education. And this is where Finland becomes complicated. Finland has a very strong state about education. Historically, it's been a very progressive state compared to other places. In order for neoliberalism to survive, it must have a national curriculum. So if Alexis is teaching something different than Michael is teaching, and I want these teachers to compete, that is not good. Alexis and Michael must teach the same thing, otherwise the metrics don't work. All right? So oddly enough, neoliberalism has a regression towards the mean in which slowly but surely teachers must teach exactly the same thing. What that does to the ArtsEqual project will be very, very interesting if neoliberal agendas come here and infect the national arts curriculum. Because right now, as the ArtsEqual project is showing, there's 1,000 flowers possibly to be bloomed. But if this is then coupled and used as a lever for neoliberalism, it's a disaster. So what happens with this? This is a vision in many ways of a strong state. So again, you must have a national that in many ways says that we must teach the same thing. And this, in many ways, means that we must have national testing, but also we must have a restoration of what is called a common culture. In no nation of the world is there really a common culture. As Pierre Bourdieu reminds us brilliantly, not only in Distinction, but in his lesser-known, more popular writings, this is a form of symbolic violence. Finland right now, like the United States, is a vast experiment. The borders have been opened, not as much as I would like, certainly better than the United States, since we had last year only 10,000 Syrian refugees for a nation of 350 million people. Okay? But given that border, what it means to be from Finland is now different. Well, that is not meant to be disrespectful of the history of the struggles of Finnish people of various kinds to create something that is not Swedish only, that is not Russian, that is not the plaything of big powers, okay? That's certainly not England, thank goodness, and it's not Norway or Sweden. That's sort of nice. But that means that this is a construction. And the move towards a false assemblage, a false consensus, that everyone agrees beforehand is an act of what Bourdieu would call symbolic violence. What is common is the question, what is common? And any curriculum that doesn't have the debate over that does not recognize that what it means, that who is here now, is indicative of a vast experiment that Finland and the United States and England should be proud of, because there are other nations that are not engaged in this, Hungary as an example. All right? Now let me give an example of the way this works. We have a new national history curriculum in the United States. It's voluntary, but all the textbooks have this, and all the tests have it. And that national curriculum says the following. We have a common culture based on a common history. We are all immigrants. We all came from elsewhere. From Finland, my grandparents from Ukraine and Russia, right? From Africa, from Syria, from Sweden and Norway, right? From Mexico. We're all the same. We have capitalism in the economy and communism in culture. We're all the same. Well, it was US federal government policy, much to my shame, as someone that I'm talking about my nation now. For 117 years, it was federal policy to give smallpox-infected blankets to indigenous people. Millions died. That doesn't sound like immigration to me. That sounds like homicide. The people who built the United States enslaved people. Right? Brilliant new archaeological and historical research that 1/3 of enslaved people stolen from Africa spoke Arabic, were literate in Arabic, and were Muslim. What does that say about the fiction that we were all Christian? The people who did the unpaid labor who built the nation for free were from Africa and Muslim. Now that is not, I'm not a romantic about terrorists, I'm not a romantic about history, but that vision of the common is what I mean by symbolic violence. And part of the task of any curriculum, especially in the arts, is to recognize that. All right? And this becomes absolutely central to any truly democratic form. Now, these two groups are the most powerful in this umbrella of conservative modernization. There's a third group that is increasingly powerful in Israel, in Pakistan, in Sudan, in India. In India, it's represented by the Hindutva movement. It's increasingly powerful throughout the world in many nations. So in Brazil, the fastest growing movement is this, and it's what I want to call authoritarian populists. This is a group that says the following: we agree with, I quote now, capitalism is God's economy. That is a quote. I spoke to her, she didn't agree. That was not nice, but I couldn't resist that. I've been so serious for so long. Authoritarian populists believe the solution will come if we return to God. That is the problem. We have secular schooling, so we must restore God to schools. I don't want to speak theoretically to this. I want to give an example of what's going on. But the fastest growing school reform in the United States, and now in Germany as well, by the way, is what's called homeschooling. Parents have pulled their children out of state schools and religious schools and private schools to school them at home. 80% are doing it for religious reasons, and these are gated ideological communities. Do not have my child go to school with a child of the other. Here's a letter that has gone to every school in the United States. It is now translated into Espanol, in German. It has now surfaced. One of my friends has sent it to me from Trondheim. It is now in Norwegian. I never thought that could humanly be possible. It's in Brazil, it's in Colombia and Argentina. It is now in Peru, Guatemala, El Salvador, and in Mexico. Okay? It sounds like Opus Dei, but it's evangelical. Here's a letter to all the teachers and to the school principal. I am the parent of certain child who attends your school. I hereby request that my child be involved in no school activities or materials listed below. Then it's a paragraph threatening lawsuit. This is what must not go on now. No discussion of values, no discussions of religion or moral standards, no open-ended discussions of any kind. Second, no discussions of death, no discussions of abortion, euthanasia, suicide, use of violence, no curricula pertaining to alcohol and drugs, no instruction in nuclear war. Well, I did that all the time when I was teaching. Children, let's get interesting. Let's build a nuclear weapon. I think it's very important. No discussion of interpersonal relationships, no discussions of parents or parenting. No education in human sexuality. Now, I am not joking with the rest of this. This includes premarital sex, extramarital sex, contraception, abortion, homosexuality, group sex and marriages, prostitution, incest, masturbation, bestiality, that is having sex with animals. I did that. Oh, no, I'm not going to go there. No discussion of the roles of males and females. No use of pornography. Am I blushing appropriately now? Okay, I can't, this, by the way, there are 10,000 schools that have received this letter. No use of hypnotism. Pay attention, this will be on the examination. No discussion of organic evolution, including the idea that women weren't available at this time, had developed from previous or lower types of living things. No discussions of witchcraft, the occult, the supernatural, or Eastern religions. Notice the suturing together. Islam, Hindu, okay, are Eastern religions. They are the equivalent of magic. No critical appraisals of other individuals, no critical appraisals of lawyers, physicians, or government ministers, no discussions of income, no discussions of personality, no questionnaires, no autobiographical assignments, logbooks, diaries, or personal journals. It goes on. With love. Okay. Now, we may laugh about this. And when I first read it, I thought it was a joke. I couldn't believe it. The ultimate form of individuation and of neoliberal agendas is parents seeing their children as not citizens of a nation, as having no responsibility whatsoever to others. It is to commodify them as products we will produce. And the ultimate way of ensuring that is to take children out of any social situation where they must deal with other cultural forms, other religious forms, other epistemological moments, or a place that might challenge them in any way to question what their parents believe. Now, my last year teaching was in a rural primary school that had an active Ku Klux Klan chapter. That is not a group that I would want my children in that class to follow. This is a formula for saying the unsayable and doing the undoable. And as I mentioned, it is the fastest growing school reform in my nation and one of the fastest growing school reforms in the world. 3 to 5 million children are being homeschooled in the United States. Okay? All right. There's a fourth group, and I'm getting close to the end before I finish up with some better thoughts about what's going on to interrupt this. This is a group, and here I must engage in what is a more elegant form of class analysis. Most criticisms of these kinds of agendas in the professional literature and the critical literature assume a two-class model. It's a traditional Marxist model, and I have 2 legs, and 1.5 of them are in that tradition. I'm not ashamed of that. I think that loss of collective memory of that tradition is actually quite dismissive and very dangerous. But why should we assume 2 classes? One of the things I want to argue is that it is perfectly possible for us to battle against neoliberal agendas of privatization and competition and partly win. And those of you who have done the research about music education and arts education know that what is common is often quite remarkable in the arts here, which is what is common is you will make your own music. And what the people who count as musicians, maybe people with dementia, maybe the elderly in a punk rock band jumping into a mosh pit, which is not smart, actually, if you're 90 years old. That's a different issue, okay? So what is common there is we will be diverse, okay? But it is perfectly possible that we will win those battles and still lose, since the policies about metrics, accountability, what counts as good testing, are often coming from a group of people that would never vote for Le Pen or Donald Trump. They would never do that. They would vote for progressives. But they believe one simple thing: if it moves in classrooms, measure it, and if it hasn't moved yet, measure it anyway in case it moves tomorrow. They have a particular kind of cultural capital, and they have colonized the space of the state, a particular form, what might be called a particular fraction of the managerial new middle class. And they believe in testing everything that moves. So they have engaged in an epistemological war. If it can't be tested, it's unimportant. That is a disaster for the arts. Okay? And we have already been through a period in the arts of what used to be called discipline-based art education, which said the more we can in some ways mirror ourselves after physics, the better we will be. That was dismissive of the creative forms of the arts, and we need not return to that. So what we have to do in many ways is to realize that this group, a particular fraction of the middle class, has opened that space, and it is often their agenda. And if their child can go to an arts school, that is fine. But arts for all in so many nations are being cut. And Finland is involved in a struggle over that increasingly. The fact, for instance, in the ArtsEqual meetings, if I can speak honestly here, when we have met with people from the ministry, or when the calls come down to Heidi and Tula and all of us that say, where is your evidence? And I now will measure you by how many articles in high-status journals you publish. It's not about the arts being worthwhile as an epistemological form. It's about what can you do to help us to document that you are doing stuff that is measurable. So it's exactly this that I want to speak to. And that's not an argument about the arts. It's an argument that we must tactically play with, because unfortunately we have no choice. Now, sometimes I do want evidence. I am not anti-evidence at all. But in English, the word accountability has two meanings. It's metrics, like an accountant. Okay? So show me your profits. Give me your measurement. But if I were to ask any of you who are involved in the arts in schools, give me an account of what goes on, what went on today, you would tell me a story. You'd give me a narrative. So this is a group fighting the epistemological war, that narratives of real lives in real schools are less important than the numbers. And that is an epistemological war, and we have to fight against that. So taken together, these four groups have formed an alliance. They don't all agree, but this is what it looks like outside of here, and slowly begins to creep in. And for those of us who are deeply involved in the arts, even a bit of this opens a door. And once that door is open, there's no guarantee that we're the only people who are going to walk into that door. Many others with different interests are walking through that door all over the world. So what's going on now to transform this? Let me spend the last 5 minutes of my talk, the words that you've been waiting for, the last 5 minutes. These are biblical minutes. However, it's like God created the world in 7 days, but each day was 1 billion years. So this 5 minutes may stretch until the pizza arrives at midnight, okay? All right. So, there's stuff going on all over the world that is not visible. And here again, I want to compliment the ArtsEqual program and the research that's being done. One of the things that this alliance, this hegemonic bloc of conservative modernization is doing is what might be called best historical amnesia, to forget the struggles and the gains that have been made. So part of our task is to restore collective memory, to be the critical secretaries of those people throughout the world who are fighting against this in real classrooms. And that means that we change metrics about what counts as good research. So as an example, of all the books I've ever written or done, the one that has sold the most, and as some of you know this story, that any books that I write or that my wife Rima writes, we do not accept royalties from them. They go to social movements. So this book, Democratic Schools, which has sold 1,250,000 copies, and the royalties I have never seen a penny of, they go to a group called Rethinking Schools in the United States, which is poets, artists, community activists, and people like me. They let in to support them, okay? So this is the kind of thing I'm talking about, and it's very visible in the research that's being produced here. It is, what is really happening? So one of the effects of this group of conservative modernizers is not just the loss of historic memory, that it could be different, that it has been different in the past, is also utter cynicism. What in English is called Tina. There is no alternative. For you know from your own research and your own work, there are alternatives being built all the time. Part of the task of people in universities is to document that, to be what I call the critical secretaries of difference, to make visible that in real life in schools throughout this nation and so many others, in real schools, it is possible, even in the face of the privatizers, the measurement experts, to create an arts education that is extraordinarily powerful. And my compliments go to you as being the best group of doctoral students and researchers that I know of in performing that function. You may not know how famous you are outside of Finland, but I can assure you that every time I write about what can be different, there's more than a little footnote to what's going on in the Sibelius Academy. I should get paid the royalties on that. Okay, all right. There's other things that needs to be done. So democratic schools is the story of 5 real schools doing remarkable things, even in the face of people saying it's impossible, or why should we give you money to do this? So it's part of a larger political mobilization around that. In my most recent book, Can Education Change Society, I also document the history of this as well. So I won't go through this, it would take too long. That's another lecture that I was tempted to give. But there have been in Finland, in the United States, in England, thousands of people whose shoulders we stand on. And part of our task is also historical work to show that this is not new, that within this nation and so many others, there have been educators, there have been people at universities, there have been musicians and artists who have spoken back. So the documentary evidence gets lost, and every time we walk through into a classroom or write something, we must remember that we are not the first to write about this, to talk about it. I'll give one example of this, and it's from Brazil. So, I've been going to Brazil since the day after the military dictatorship was kicked out. You'll forgive this is emotional in some ways to some of you. But one of the things that is recognizable is how powerful that history was and is, of people in favelas, which we tend to translate into English as slums. That's exactly the wrong word for it. In poor communities that have built up cultural forms of art, of music, that is transforming people's lives. It keeps history alive. In the same way, for instance, by the way, that enslaved people keep recipes. Since women's work was to keep alive the history of lived culture within a community that was torn out of its geographic location and often murdered. And in the favelas are these memories of teachers and communities working together. And that also is part of the epistemological war. History is unimportant, the history of arts education in communities, in various communities and regions in all our nations. That must be restored to make it legitimate, not just because it's nice, but because we have a debt to pay. All of us stand on the shoulders of people who come before us. And that debt is paid through the restoration of memory of who else has walked this path. Finally, something else that must be done, and that is to always remember that what we are facing is no harder, this is my final words, than Emma's, I've lost Emma's words, my God. Excuse me, oh dear God, there it is, okay. There once was a time in human history in the United States where a young woman named Emma, the age of 18 and a half, was evaluated as a teacher by making certain that the child would stand with a perfect angle of 45 degrees. I got an A in geometry, so that is a perfect angle of 45 degrees. And the hand that the book held in the right hand, not the left. The nose pointing directly ahead. And to speak in loud and unnatural tones so that the teacher would be considered good and the student would be seen as docile but perhaps smart. Well, these people are backed in many nations. We owe a debt to Emma and to the millions of Emmas throughout the world who said the following: I am a teacher. You can't do that to me. Thank you for your patience. The end on Emma's words. The lecture is over.
Thank you, Michael, so much for this insightful lecture that has given us, for sure, lots to think about for a long time. We have now time for some questions, but you need to remember to speak to this microphone close enough. So, any questions or comments?
Alexis has been waiting to get back at me for a year now.
I haven't. But I am interested in your thoughts. You talked a little bit about the co-option of the term of democracy by the right and the sort of neoliberal agenda, which is something I've continued to think about. And if we think that ideas of the common do involve acts of symbolic violence, I wonder about the alternatives in such a neoliberal climate, if you like, especially if we think of hyper-individualism as one of the sort of key facets of that neoliberal agenda. And I've been thinking a lot about if we take democratic participation to mean sort of compulsory visibility as well, which very easily feeds into the sort of surveillance and governance, right? So in envisioning alternatives outside of this, I think it's very easy that freedom itself becomes a sort of neoliberal construction if we're looking at those sort of available options and constructions of social norms. So how can resistance gain that sort of power of a collective without the common? Sorry, that wasn't so docile or smart or articulate.
Yes, it was. Okay. First of all, we have to ask, because I'm giving an outline of stuff based on 2 books, I was actually a bit more rhetorical. We have to ask, does neoliberalism have any, I don't want to say redeeming values, is it a contradictory assemblage? For whom? So let me give an example. I talked in general about neoliberalism. The fastest growing group, not by numbers, but by statistics, that is using homeschooling are African American people in the United States and in other nations. I can either say, you are stupid, don't you understand my arguments? Or I can use Gramsci better and say, there are always elements of good sense and bad sense. People are not stupid, they understand their situation. So let me place that within the history of African American assemblages around democracy in the United States and elsewhere as a way of entering into this question. So, in general, neoliberalism is hyper-individuation. However, the way in which African Americans or people of African descent here as well are portrayed in the media are the following. Largely through popular television, where the black man is a drug dealer or a sexual predator, hyper-masculine, or gay, okay? But not normal. And a black woman is seen as an object of white male desire. Right? So the code that is affixed to the black body is irrational, and the body itself is where intellect resides. And what I mean by that is always using cunning to get something, whether it's drugs, whether it's theft, whether it's sex. Okay? Now, that vision of irrationality, anything that interrupts that is partly counter-hegemonic. So in the United States, there are black nationalist groups, as well as, for instance, right now in Brazil, okay? Within Afro-Brazilian mobilizations in Salvador, for instance, I've been working with, where they will say, look, the left gives me rhetoric, the right gives me power. That's really interesting. And what they're saying is this: if you deny me rationality because you don't think I'm intelligent, or I'm a predator, or I'm a drug dealer, but you don't give me rationality, what neoliberalism does is give me something that I can prove my rationality. It's an identity form that says, given enough information, I can participate as an individual in exactly the same way that Michael or Alexis can participate. So we have to, is that clear? Okay, so it's an interruption. So you have to ask if Afro-Brazilians or African Americans then say there is something about neoliberalism that is counter-hegemonic, I have to think very, very carefully about when we say hyper-individualism. So Apple, you and I would agree, that it is hyper-individualism. If you're denied the notion that you're an individual, neoliberalism actually colonizes that space very creatively. It's one of the reasons, for instance, that I've spent the last, up until Can Education Change Society, the last 4 books saying, if you want to change schools and use schools to transform society in more progressive and aesthetically rich dimensions, look at the right. They know what they're doing. Don't look at the left, because they occupy the spaces that are progressive. So that's the first part of the response. Your more Foucaultian kind of analysis, which I think is very clever in a good sense, not in the usual sort of dismissive sense. So there is no doubt that this notion that participation to form the common, as an example, that I'm valorizing that. But that can lead, given other aspects of measurement and metrics, and the idea that you must be on display all the time, right? That's the new middle class assemblage in the colonization of the state, and that cuts across class lines. That actually becomes crucial, and that has to be fought against. This is where I think Brazil can teach us something. So in Can Education Change Society, I tell the story of what's going on in Porto Alegre in Brazil, which is my favorite place right now about these kinds of things, where in favelas, where the poorest schools, teachers are paid an extra month's salary to go into the favelas, the poor communities, and learn from the kids and their parents how to connect the national curriculum, sort of national curriculum, to the religious and musical and aesthetic and cultural forms. Teachers bring that back. The kids participate then with parents in building a curriculum that is responsive, but also aimed towards the national test, because you're not doing kids any favors if they fail the test. That's the form of mobility. Okay? At the same time, there are school councils where principals, school administrators, are elected by even students having a vote. So any child above the age of 12 gets a vote on who the school principal should be. The principals do in the communities. Now the state says, we want you to participate, but there's no sanctions. And the community decides democratically who its representatives will be. So in some ways, that act of surveillance is minimized because it's the community collectively that's deciding. Not everyone will participate, but in terms of who will be on the school boards, who will be determining what the curriculum will be officially, it's the mobilization from below. The state has agreed it will not surveil. All right? Now, that is not a permanent solution. many of the people who were from the favelas, who formed the Workers' Party, became corrupt. So to me, this is not a problem to be solved. It seems to me that your question, which again, let me say again, is very important, shows that it is always possible for dominant groups to reach in and steal elements of good sense. So I have a mantra: don't put in place anything that you can't control later on. If it comes from below, as I hope it does, always recognize that the world is contradictory. And those contradictions can be used in ways that you don't anticipate. I'll give just one last example of that. Our beloved governor in Wisconsin is a hard right person, neoliberal and neoconservative, and a deeply conservative religious advocate, very conservative. And he has unions. He has his people control our state senate. There's a law called Act 10 that says the following: at the end of each year, on December 31st, all public unions dissolve. And a teachers' union, a social work union, the union goes away on December 31st. On December 31st, the union must hold a new election, and more than 50% of all of the members, not just the members who vote, must vote for the union to exist again. All right? When that was passed, there was a huge demonstration in minus 20 degrees. That went on for a month. Many of my students, my grandson and I went to the demonstration, slept in the Capitol building. The police slept with the demonstrators. Remarkable, because they're members of a public sector union. Okay? So, everyone's applauding. That's good. The next week, undocumented immigrants and documented immigrants, people from Mexico, from Nigeria, etc., marched. So instead of 250,000 people demonstrating, the next week, not one teachers' union or public sector union representative marched with the immigrants. So the marching and demonstrations, which everyone applauded as good, fully participatory, then caused many of the immigrants to say, maybe the right is correct. Maybe teachers' unions are bad ideas. Because you struggled, we marched with you, you didn't march with us. Okay? So I want to use that as an example. So here is something most of us would agree with as a form of political mobilization to defend rights, fully participatory, and yes, it was surveilled with the police with cameras. But the next week, the option was chosen, it was a warmer day too, not to march with the immigrants. So it became an act that pushed people to the right at exactly the same moment. So that's on my mind whenever I think about these kinds of issues. There's no guarantees in this. The word I use in this, it's a constitutive dilemma. It doesn't go away. And unless we take Alex's question seriously every moment, say, what are the contradictions? Who can mobilize around this? Who will control that? Unless I build in the mechanisms, and that's my point about a common culture. Unless we have the question constantly being asked, whose knowledge is this? Whose common is this? So what's common is the question. Then it's a false consensus. Okay? Good question, thank you.
Thanks. In your talk, you mentioned the ambivalence or the paradox in that how ArtsEqual is expected to show evidence of the impact of the arts for society. And as you know, as the member of the advisory group, we are also expected to produce policy briefs and policy recommendations for ministries, stakeholders, policymakers, but also for teachers and schools. Not only to communicate our research results, but also to tell what should be changed and for what reasons. Could you say something about the opportunities, but also about the pitfalls of these kinds of policy processes that we are now tackling in our project?
Yes, I can. Is that a good answer? Okay. No, okay. That was your question. No. Okay, excuse me. Well, this is something, again, that Heidi and I and many people in this room have had conversations about. First of all, it is a partial victory, and that should always be remembered. So in most nations of the world, this group would have no voice. Okay? That's really crucial to understand. It is a victory. So let me use the, when I am in China, so Rima and I are professors at a number of Chinese universities, what counts as the arts are traditional, often. Some of the students are unbelievably talented, but that's because that's all they do. But it is used for mobility, and the government will collect statistics on the importance of music. But it's used in a very paradoxical way. It's not about the aesthetic form, it's to show how smart our children are, okay? And how dedicated our parents are compared to the rest of the world. Okay? Now that's slightly stereotypical and overstated, but it's a very different iteration of why the arts. So first, I'd want to again say, first let's recognize that there was some success. So I mentioned earlier, this research group and this strange ministry that has stuff that I just want to say, what? No, these signifying devices don't go together. A Ministry of Education committed to stuff that sounds increasingly neoliberal, okay? Also saying we're going to give 3 to 5 million equivalent euros to you. There's something bizarre about that. That's not supposed to happen in the real world. That means that there's something going on that tactically was brilliant. I would love to see a dissertation on that. Part of my area is critical policy analysis. I want to know how that happened. And I think actually that is crucial, because my argument has always been you want to look at who's really successful in changing curriculum in schools, look at the right. And well, here is an instance in Finland in which neoliberals were forced to compromise and did so willingly. I know of almost no other nation where the arts have that status. So it actually says something important about your question, which is, by couching it as sort of, oh, well, we've been co-opted. That's not how you asked it, but that's normally what happens of, okay, so we won this victory, sort of, and guess what? Now we have all this metric stuff and accountability stuff. Guess what? We're losing it. I want to turn it around. I want to say, what's unusual about this is the fact that this is funded. And you're able actually, thank you, Trula, for all the work you've been doing all this stuff in the last weeks, and Heidi and everyone else. They have said, if you provide us with evidence, you may get extra, you may get more money. That's crazy. And you'll forgive me for speaking quite openly and honestly about this. This is very, very unusual. So that means rather than the right or neoliberal agendas colonizing that space, A door has been opened in which you walked through and then opened another door. I want to know how that happened. And I want to know what are and this will be now private. I want to know how in the face of that victory is maintained. Because it hasn't changed from what I can recognize that much of the research. It has changed in some ways the metrics that you're held accountable to. But the stuff that's being documented still seems pretty robust to me. Now, I may personally, whether I'm a member of the advisory board or not, I may be seeing certain kinds of things. So the stuff I'm seeing are some of the most progressive doctoral dissertations. But I know when I'm at the research meetings and listening to others, a lot of it sounds really progressive and interesting. So I'd want to know what are the ways in which people now have reoccupied the space that neoliberalism, for some reason, has been forced or convinced to keep open. That would be the question I'd want to ask. But there's no doubt in my mind that there are pitfalls here. In other nations where there have been gains, for instance, that space is slowly closed. So an example would be what is happening in Porto Alegre, which is the place that I am. These are my teachers. So I've been working in Porto Alegre, and I've been writing about it for many, many years. So you want to see more about that, look at can education change society. But for the last 10 years, 12 now, a right-wing neoliberal and neoconservative government was put in power. They said they would not change the democratic forms of the curriculum, which means that the arts are robust. They're learned from the community. Mathematics is taught through music, and not as a way of co-opting math, but to guarantee a place for music. I want to say, thank God. But the new administration has said, we're going to make it, we can no longer afford for the teachers to go out as often as before. We'll do it occasionally, maybe for a week. And my assumption is that in the next years, there'll be no money for that because they're cutting teachers' salaries. So there are no doubt that in many nations now, those pitfalls are eating the opportunities. So what I would urge this group to do is now to start a running account, a lived history of the struggles. First, to keep the memory alive, but also I need to know how to interrupt neoliberal agendas. And I'm not opposed at all to tactical things. So if I were in the situation that this group is in with ArtsEqual, would I learn creatively how to turn neoliberal rhetoric against neoliberalism? You bet your life I would. Would I creatively write reports that are couched in the language of employment or robust research results? Or with our narratives, we also have the following data? Would I creatively use those data? Would I fund people who are doing various kinds of research that are narratives and historical and ethnographic and qualitative, and also, whenever possible, have some data to back it up tactically? Yes. Would I feel guilty about it? Yes. Would I try very, very hard to think tactically about what the dangers are, and then have constant meetings that say, whoa, have we crossed the line? And then say, what can I do to walk back from that line? This is another dilemma. Someone by the initials of Karl Marx, KM, once said a very brilliant thing that most of you have heard before. People make their own histories, but never under conditions of their own choosing. So I wasn't being rhetorical when I'm saying this is the power that exists right now. It's increasing in Finland, though Finland is still partly an exception. But every nation that I know of that was partly an exception, that partly gets weaker and weaker and weaker in this region. Okay? So I guess I would want to say this is reality. Now, how do you keep alive the opportunities? And how tactically can we steal? They stole our language, the language of democracy, the language of freedom, not as an economic term, but as an agenda of epistemological mobilization. Okay, so can we be creative and use their language as a form of defense? Will this be our Svemalina? I don't know. But this nation has a history of that. So anyway, I'm sorry I go on for so long. These are complicated and interesting questions.
Yes, we could go on for a while. But I think it's time to end this session. Please thank once again Professor Michael Apple. And if you want to see and listen to Michael again, tomorrow at noon in Black Box, in Camerata, across the hall, Tuulikki Lais will defend her doctoral dissertation, which is part of the ArtsEqual project as well. And Professor Michael Apple will serve as opponent, so welcome there as well. So have a nice evening and enjoy the sun still probably out there. Thank you.